Okay, well, our next speaker is going to be Geoffrey Lizar, and his advisor was Shauna Colson, and his secondary advisor was Dr. Marta Kudas, and the graduate student working with him was Crystal Poole. So, a garden full of angry bees, effects of context on emotional valence. Jeff.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kudas. As mentioned, my topic is emotional valence, and our first order of business is to figure out exactly what that means. So we all know that words can be emotional. A word like dessert summons up feelings of happiness or yumminess or contentment, while a word like torture hopefully doesn't. That being said, science likes numbers. Generally, the best way to analyze something is to put it in numbers, and one way we can do that with emotion in language is with Peter Lang's self-assessment mannequin, or SAM scale. The SAM scale runs from 1 to 9, with 1 representing words that feel completely negative, characterized by feeling completely unhappy, annoyed, unsatisfied, melancholic, despaired, or bored, and 9 representing words that feel completely positive, characterized by feeling completely happy, pleased, satisfied, contented, or hopeful. And then, of course, numbers between 1 and 9 indicate intermediate feelings, with 5 being completely neutral. So now we're going to run a little experiment. On a scale from 1 to 9, how negative or positive does this word make you feel? So now, if you're like me, you probably rated that somewhere around here in the negative range between 1 and 5, maybe about a 2 or a 3. But if you did, how much do you think that your rating was affected by my characterization of the bees as angry? So back in 1999, Bradley and Lang created their affective norms for English words, or ANU database, by doing pretty much what we just did. They gave participants a list of words, and they had those participants rate those words on several characteristics, including emotional valence. However, they presented the words without any context, which is potentially problematic. Context is important, as we just saw. If I tell you that the garden is full of angry bees, then you'll probably feel a bit more negative about the word than if I tell you that the garden was pollinated by a hive of bees. So our hypothesis was this. If we put words in emotional context, their perceived valence will change. But why does it matter? Well, many studies have shown that emotional valence can affect how our brains process language. In one example, researchers found that negative language amplified syntactic violations. Martin Lotus et al. Ran an experiment where they showed people sentences that included an adjective that was either positive, negative, or neutral. And then they manipulated that adjective. They either presented it correctly, or they introduced a syntactic violation where they incorrectly pluralized the adjective. They were doing this in Spanish. Or they introduced a semantic violation where they completely replaced the word with a similarly valenced but blatantly incorrect word. And what they found was that for syntactic errors, people noticed the mistakes faster when the word was negative. To quote their study, it seems that a negative emotional meaning in a word promptly summons attentional resources. And of course, this is only one example of many that's found an inherent link between emotion and language. So to test our hypothesis, we decided to do a partial replication of Bradley and Lang's ANU study, but putting the words in context. We selected 90 nouns. We specifically picked nouns because we found during our literature search that word class, so whether a word was noun, adjective, verb, etc., interacted with emotional valence. So we wanted to stick to just nouns. But yes, we selected 90 nouns and we split those between 45 negative words and 45 positive words. And then we stuck each of those 90 words at the end of both a negative sentence and a positive sentence, which gave us 4 conditions. So, for instance, during a trial block, when rating the word disaster, a participant would first be presented with a sentence reading either, the earthquake was a tragic natural disaster, or he looked up just in time to avert the disaster. We split our study into 4 sections. First, a training block that got them used to the SAM scale and our attention checks. where instead of rating the word, they were asked a true or false question about the sentence they just read. And then they had 2 blocks where the words were presented in context. And then they had a block at the end that had them rating the words out of context so that we made sure we had an accurate comparison point and we didn't just assume that data from 1999 still applied. So before we get into what we really found, let's take a look at some hypotheticals that fall on either side of our hypothesis. First, I want to direct your attention to the y-axis here, which has to do with our valence rating. As you may have noticed, this is not a 1 through 9 scale. We decided it would be a little more intuitive to visualize if we shifted the center from 5 being neutral to 0 being neutral. So after we did our ratings on the 1 to 9 scale, we subtracted 5 from everything, centering the scale on 0 and going from -4 to 4. So moving on, what we're looking at here is that we've split our nouns into negative words only and positive words only. And then these gray bars here represent the ANU data. Ideally, our out of context ratings here in the black will line up roughly equivalent with their ratings, which will mean that we were successful in our replication. And then if our hypothesis is correct about the context, then we should see an overall bump in valence when we're looking at words in a positive context, and an overall drop in valence when we're looking at words in a negative context. On the other hand, if we're wrong and it turns out that context has no effect, we should see something more like this, where it doesn't really matter what context you put the words in, there's no change in the valence rating. So what did we find? Well, let's take a look at our no context scenario first. Turns out, yeah, we got pretty close. And indeed, all of the metrics that we used to look at variance confirmed that there was no significant difference between our ratings and the ANU ratings, which was it was a confirmation and a sigh of relief. Unfortunately, that was also true when we looked at negative nouns in a negative context and positive nouns in a positive context, which went directly against our hypothesis. As you can see from the 95% confidence interval represented in these error bars here, the shift was in the correct direction, but it was not enough to quite achieve significance. However, when we looked at contrasting context, that is negative nouns in a positive context and positive nouns in a negative context, we found that, yeah, there was a significant shift, again, confirmed by every metric we used. So as it happens, it's not that context always matters, but that contrasting context matters. When the context that a word is in clashes with our expectations of that word, that's when context matters the most. And we can also look at this effect on the level of individual words. Since the positive words in a negative context condition was the one that had the biggest shift, we're going to start by looking at that one. And again, I want to direct your attention to the axes. We're only going from -2 to 4 here. We've cropped out a little bit of white space. But on the x-axis, we have our out of context ratings. And then on the y-axis, we have our negative context ratings. This blue line, this blue diagonal line right here represents the line y equals x, which represents a hypothetical no change scenario. So if context had no effect, then all of our dots would be on the line. And then this dashed red line here is our regression line. But anything above this blue line represents a positive effect of context, so context shifting the rating up, and anything below represents a negative shift. And as you can see, this is a negative context, and basically all of our words, except for one, fall below the blue line, and most fall significantly below. Interestingly, we also found that the more positive a word was, the more susceptible it was to negative context. If all the words were shifted roughly equivalently, we'd expect to see that our regression line would have a slope of 1 as well, just with a lower y-intercept. However, the slope is below 1. It's between 0 and 1, which indicates that the points on this side of the graph are pulling it down more, meaning that they were shifted more in general. And yeah, that concept holds true when we look at our other condition that showed a significant effect. When placed in a negative context, the stronger the negative out of context rating was, the stronger or the larger of an effect that context could have. This one is not quite as dramatic as our other comparison here, but the effect does hold up in this one as well. Which brings us to our next big takeaway. For conditions where context has a significant effect at all, the stronger the starting valence was, the larger the effect was. All that said, you might have noticed earlier that there was a legitimate potential criticism of our design. Our sentence is made for fairly messy contexts, which is not great for controlling things experimentally. So to address that, we decided to replicate the experiment with much simpler contexts. And yeah, it's harder to find simpler contexts than a single word. So for the second experiment, we placed our nouns next to emotional adjectives. So we had word pairs like painful death versus peaceful death, or screaming infant versus cute infant. And the procedure that we used for this part was essentially identical to the first experiment. And as it turns out, yeah, word pairs work too. Not only do they work too, they work better. On the left, we have our results from the first experiment, and on the right, we have our results from the second experiment. As you can see, it's the same pattern, just a little more exaggerated for the adjectives. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, I am going to be skipping over looking at the scatter plots for the adjective conditions. I will say they lined up pretty perfectly with what we found in the sentence contexts. But we're going to skip right to our conclusion and say, okay, where does that leave us? Well, it turns out context matters, or more specifically, contrasting context matters. Also, the stronger that a noun's out of context valence was, the more that that contrasting context mattered. And one possible reason for that, and this is simply a hypothesis, our results can't possibly confirm that, but one possible reason is that it may be that the emotional valence is not tied to a specific word, but instead to a concept. And by changing the context in which a word is presented, we're keeping the word the same, but we're changing the concept that's activated in our minds. So, you know, both of these are pictures of bees, but angry bee looks a little bit different in our minds than happy bee or busy bee. However, like I said, our results can't really confirm or deny that, and more research would be needed before we can say anything about that for sure. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you so much to my committee for all of the guidance, Dr. Shauna Colson, Dr. Marta Kudis, and my grad student, Crystal Poole. And thank you all for coming to the presentation. And of course, thank you to the honors cohort. It's been great working with y'all.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have any questions?